This is the one I know. I always grab it by this. I've learned after like 6 times, so 6 times the charm. But that's awesome. As always, I just want to thank you guys for having me here. It's always hugely appreciated. You know, I love being here. I love you guys. You guys are so encouraging. You guys are loving. It's like my own family. So I really do genuinely always appreciate you guys. So, and I'll never get sick of saying that, and I'll say it every time. So if you get sick of hearing it, I apologize. But seriously, I love you guys. But so last time, you know, this is going to kind of be like a boy who cried wolf, because last time I made a joke about us going through the book of Psalms, but today we are going to go through the book of Jonah. So, and that's not a joke. So today we're going to go through the book of Jonah, because one of the things that I've noticed with the book of Jonah is that he is the overplayed and overlooked prophet. And that might seem kind of contradictory. That might seem kind of like, what do you mean? And what I mean by that is, a lot of times as children, right, we've heard of who Jonah is. We see him, you know, these cute little pictures of a big blue whale and this guy who's all like smiling. And this is what we think of when we see Jonah. But he's kind of overlooked in terms of what he really stands for and what it really means. Because we hear it as a child. It's a story, this awesome story, like, wow, God kept this guy alive in a man's stomach. Isn't that so cool? Look at his power. Like, look at how awesome he is. But there is so much more to what Jonah really is. Like, it's not just about how impressive God's power is. There's so much richness in how we can live and how we can learn to live, and really more about God's character in terms of his sovereignty, his mercy, and his love. There's so much from Jonah that we can really learn. So what I'm going to ask you guys to do is, if you guys can follow me along, we can open up to Jonah. We'll actually start right at the first verse. Jonah 1 through 3. The word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come before me. But Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed to Tarshish. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship bound for a port. After paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed for Tarshish to flee from the Lord. So we see right up front, right? God gives Jonah, a prophet, who's got his own book in the Bible, right? He gives him a directive, and he just blatantly disobeys. And we have this idea of like, what Nineveh? He tells him to go to Nineveh. What is Nineveh? Think of like ISIS, North Korea. This is like the worst of the worst places, right? It's a place that just is completely full of just violence, terror, you know, people being murdered, women being raped. Like, it's a horrible place. And he's like, hey, I want you to go there and tell them about me. How would you feel if God asked you to go to North Korea, or go right in the middle grounds of where maybe ISIS is, you know? And we'll find out later, you know, why he didn't want to go. And one of the main reasons he didn't want to go is because he knew that God was going to be compassionate and loving on Nineveh, and he knew that there would be a way for them to come back, that God would protect them and save them. And he didn't want that. And sometimes I wonder, do we have that same heart? We don't want to go and tell someone maybe about Jesus. We don't want to maybe share the love. We think, no, they don't deserve it. They are way far beyond. It doesn't matter. But these people are broken and lost, and they don't have any idea of who God is, really and genuinely, of our God. And they deserve the same right that we do to get to know who he is. It doesn't matter how horrible they are, because, right, we've all come from some sort of sin. We are no better than they. We are all come from something. And so we see that there's this materialistic military society, right, that he's also afraid to go to. So there's also the scared component, like, what's going to happen to me? And there's these people who believe in many gods. So how am I going to convince them to believe in just one God? And it all seems to happen so fast, right? We read this in just a couple verses. He asks him to go to preach, and he says, but Jonah ran away from the Lord. He headed to Tarshish. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship bound for that port. After paying for the fare, he went aboard and sailed for Tarshish to flee from the Lord. It sounds like, because it's in one verse, it sounds like God just went, go left, and he was like, nope. But this is a thought out disobedience, because we're not in today's society, right? We can't just jump in a car, we can't just jump on a plane. This is someone who had to walk and continually think of his disobedience. He had to continue to make that travel. He had to continue to keep doing what he was doing. He had to actually get the money. He had to figure out how he's going to get the money to get on the ship. He had to figure out where he wanted to go. He had to say, I want to go completely opposite direction. It was a continuous decision. It wasn't just a one time, like, I'm just making one choice and I ended up here. It was a continuous disobedience. And so it seems like it happened so fast, but we have to remember that there's really a huge gap of time here, and we have to think of their times and how it would have looked. So we see that his disobedience was well planned. And then we move on to verses 4 and 5. It says, "Then the Lord sent a great wind, a great wind on the sea, and such a violent storm arose from the ship, threatened to break it up. All the sailors were afraid, and each cried out to his own God, and they threw the cargo into the sea to lighten the ship." And so we see that Jonah's disobedience is now affecting other people. So his disobedience is not just affecting Jonah anymore, but it's affecting, in a real way, these other people. It says they needed to throw off stuff to lighten their ship. These are people who make their money off of delivering cargo. And to lighten the ship, we're not talking about throwing 1 or 2 pieces off. We're talking about throwing bunches off. You have this huge, giant ship. If you need to lighten that so it's going to prevent it from sinking and so you can get better control, we're not talking about throwing a couple pieces. We're talking about a huge financial, substantial loss for these people because of Jonah's disobedience. So we see that there's this idea that our disobedience can then cause and create issues for other people. And so for me, I just think about the times in my life where maybe I could have listened and could have really done what God had asked me to do, and how it caused problems for other people. And so for me, this is just a real life, real genuine thing. And I'm sure if we all think about times in our life, when we felt like God wanted us to do something and we saw the consequence play out not only in our own life, but in someone else's life, whether it's marriage, whether it's a friendship, whether it's even an enemy, so to speak, whether, whoever it is, we all make decisions, and those things can play consequences in everybody's life around us. They don't just affect us. It's not just about us. And so the thing that really was just big for me is just how he now becomes responsible for their loss. And so we move on we'll skip ahead a little bit to Jonah 7 through 12. And it says, "Then the sailors said to each other, 'Come, let us cast lots to find out who was responsible for this calamity.' They cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. So they asked him, 'Tell us who is responsible for making all this trouble for us. What kind of work do you do? Where do you come from? What is your country? From what people are you?' He answered, 'I am Hebrew. I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land.' This terrified them, and they asked, 'What have you done?' They knew he was running away from the Lord because he had already told them so. The sea was getting rougher and rougher, so they asked him, 'What should we do? What should we do to you to make the sea calm for us?' 'Pick me up and throw me in the sea,' he replied, 'and it will become calm. I know that it is my fault that the great storm has come upon you.'" What I think is awesome here is Jonah gets made, essentially, right? They find out it's him, but he comes to terms with his decision, and he takes responsibility for it, right? He could sit there and decide to say, this wasn't me. He could sit there and say, "I want to stay on the ship. I want to be in the safe place." But he says, "You know what? I got myself into this mess. It's affecting you, and I need to take responsibility for this. So just get me off the ship. Protect yourselves." He was willing to put his life on the line. He was willing to sacrifice himself, in the sense, and maybe it's not always in a literal sense of our life. Maybe it's a financial, whatever that struggle, whatever that sacrifice is, because you've made a decision. Put yourself in a situation where someone else is being affected. What can I now do to take responsibility of that situation, so that I can remove myself, or I can do whatever it is to make this easier on them, because I've caused them this harm, I've caused them this turmoil, but then I can, unfortunately, maybe have some sort of penalty for that, because I've put myself into this position. So Jonah really comes to terms with it, and he rights his wrong. And to me, I just think that's amazing. I mean, we're talking about a storm. We're talking about, crazy waves crashing. Could you imagine the fear that you're looking into that, thinking, there's no way I'm making this out. There's no way. I don't know. Me personally, I don't know how I'd respond. I don't know if I'd be like, "Yeah, just throw me over. That's gonna work out." So I don't know. That's just me personally. But so I just think it's awesome that he took responsibility to save the men on the ship. And then we see in verses 13 to 15, it says, "Instead, the men did their best to row back to the land, but they could not, for the sea grew even wilder than before. Then they cried out to the Lord, 'Please, Lord, do not let us die for taking this man's life. Do not hold us accountable for killing an innocent man, for you, Lord, have done as you pleased.' Then they took Jonah and threw him overboard, and the raging seas grew calm." So we do see that he took that responsibility, did what needed to be done, and now these men, their lives, maybe more of their cargo, their financial situation, it all levels out. And maybe it doesn't always look that instantaneous in these situations, of course. Sometimes when we do damage, there's time and there's things that need to be rebuilt, and I get that. But the point is that sometimes we need to take the responsibility and do what needs to be done, because if we've made the wrong choice, we need to be willing to work through that to make the right choice to better those people. And so the last thing, in the last two verses, we see, at this time the men greatly feared the Lord, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows to him. And this is what I think is so awesome, because they tried to avoid the option, but then what they did, they made a vow to God, right? And yeah, these are people who are pagans and they're willing to kind of accept any God, but they recognized in this very moment that it was the God of Israel that was creating this. That God was real to them in that moment. And to me, I see what I call beauty in the midst of defiance, right? Because of this poor choice that he had made, right, God still allowed there to be an opportunity to be used. Because Jonah was now still able to show these men who the true God is. Because back then, everybody had their own God for different reasons and all this stuff. But they were able to see the real God. Like, wow, this guy, as soon as you threw him off the ship, things calmed. This God is real. And to me, like, even though he disobeyed, he's still an opportunity to bring people to him, to God. And I don't know, I think to myself, sometimes we think we make a really bad choice and it's not redeemable, but right, God can work good for all of those who love him, right? He can work together all things. So it's just like, to me, it's like, that is so cool. Like, he went on this thing, he disobeyed, clearly disobeyed, right? Had a planned disobedience, yet God still allowed a bad situation to be used to glorify himself. And I just think that's awesome. And so nothing else is really said about these men, whether or not they live their lives, whether or not they continue to live, but I would have to imagine at least one, just at least one, and one to me is enough. And so the sailors acknowledge the God of Israel is in control, and then we see in the last statement, it just says, now the Lord provided a huge fish, swallowed Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of a fish 3 days and 3 nights. And so the one thing I think is kind of funny is that a lot of times in our lives, right, we have this idea of how God should rescue us. You know, there's this cute little anecdote of, there's this guy who's on a tip of his house, and his whole town is flooding, and he really feels like God tells him, I'm going to rescue from this. I'm going to save you. So a guy comes by in a boat, and he's like, hey, come on, jump in. He's like, no. He's like, God's got me. It's cool. It's fine. No worries. I'm trusting God. Next guy comes in. He's in a kayak, and he's like, we got one extra seat for you. Come on. Like, let's go. And he's like, no, don't worry. God's got me. It's cool. Next guy comes in. He's in a raft, and he's like, come on. Hey, like, come in, like, we'll help you. And it's getting to the point where it's getting so close. He's like, no, it's okay. God's got me. And then all of a sudden, he dies. I mean, not all of a sudden, right? He drowns. But he's dead. And he goes to heaven. He's like, I don't understand, God. You told me you had this. And God's like, I sent 3 different opportunities for you to be saved. 3 different opportunities. Sometimes we have this mentality, right? Like, we imagine it to be like this golden horse, like maybe a yacht's going to pull up, and it's because it's God, and it's going to be this amazing, beautiful, save thing. Like, my whole life is going to be great and perfect because God's going to come and save me on this beautiful yacht. But that's not what he does. He saves them with a fish. Right? It wasn't another boat that came up. It wasn't a fish. A fish came and swallowed him. That is not like the best of circumstances, right? So it's like, I don't know about you, but I don't really like, I'm not getting ready to book my flight on the Jonah the Fish tour. But so for me, like, this shows God's power, his sovereignty, right? And it shows his mercy, because Jonah clearly disobeyed, yet God still saved him. But what's even more awesome is, and we'll find out, God saves him for a purpose. It's not God just didn't save him. God saved him for a purpose. There was a reason for that. And so, for me, I just think we have to sometimes realize that God works in ways that we don't understand because he's God. Like, we can't fathom them, and we're not to judge those ways. We're not to try to figure out those ways. We are supposed to just be thankful for those ways. And that's exactly what we see in Jonah too. So I'm going to read through this prayer here. He says, in my distress, I called to the Lord, and he answered me. From deep in the realm of the dead, I called for help, and you listened to my cry. You hurled me into the depths, into the very hearts of the sea, and the currents swirled around me. All your waves and breakers swept over me. I said, I have been banished from your sight, yet I will look up again toward the holy temple. The engulfing waters threatened me. They surrounded me. Seaweed was wrapped around my head. To the roots of the mountains I sank down. The earth beneath me barred me in forever. But you, Lord my God, brought my life up from the pit. When my life was ebbing away, I remembered you, Lord. and my prayers rose to you, to your holy temple. Those who cling to worthless idols turn away from God's love for them. But I, with shouts of grateful praise, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed, I will make good. I will say, salvation comes from the Lord. And the Lord commanded the fish and vomited Jonah onto dry land. And so we see, right, Jonah's in this situation, and he doesn't whine or complain, but he actually gives thanks. He's like, this isn't the best situation, but I'm not looking to the circumstance of, why did you give me only a fish? But he looks at the circumstance of saying, thank you for saving my life, right? There's a difference between how we view those things. It's a perspective. You know, are we looking to, why is it only this? Or are we looking to the actual, like, love and mercy and grace and what is good? Are we being thankful? Are we having these thankful hearts? And so I just think, how many times does God provide for us and we're maybe not that grateful, not that appreciative, not that thankful. And that has to change the way we ultimately want to worship and pray to Him, right? If we're always looking to the negative, if we're always finding the things and we're never being grateful or thankful, we're not really going to want to spend time with Him. We're not really going to want to do what He asks us to do, right? We're not trusting because we'd have nothing to trust. But when we look and be thankful for the things that He has given us, for the things that He has provided us, then it changes everything. And so we see here that that's exactly what Jonah does. He gives thanks in the midst. And then the whale spits him out onto dry land at that very moment, right? And it shows another demonstration of God's mercy, His sovereignty, and His power. And so to me, that's just awesome. But then here's what to me is like what is the awesome part. So God gives him a second chance, right? The next verse says, then the word of the Lord came to Jonah a second time. Go to the great city of Nineveh and proclaim the message I give you. Jonah obeyed the word of the Lord and went to Nineveh. So we see here that Jonah this time obeys. He comes from a thankful heart. He comes from a totally different perspective, and he actually decides, I'm going to do this. And I think when we recognize how real God is in our lives, it makes us fearless, right? It makes us have a heart like Him. It totally changes things. And we'll want to actually go hard after whatever He's asking us to do. And so one of the things that I think is interesting for me is just the fact that Jonah, and we'll see this in a moment, Jonah's kind of a flip-flopper, you know, and I say this because what we're going to learn is there's the moments in Jonah's life where he is doing what God is asking him to do. He is being grateful and he's being thankful, and you see the fruit. And then you see when he's not, you see everything else. So it's kind of this idea of like, hey, here's the two different ways you can live, and here's when you follow God, and here's when you don't. And so it's kind of an interesting thing, because I think it's funny, and we'll find out more as we continue, but I think it's funny that this, to be honest, sometimes I look and I think it's ironic that it made it. You know what I mean? Because Jonah is not necessarily not the idol, but the model prophet. So, but we see on, right, Jonah verses 4 and 5. Jonah began going a day's journey into the city, proclaiming, 40 more days and Nineveh will be overthrown. The Ninevites believed God. A fast was proclaimed, and all of them, from the greatest to the least, put on sackcloth. Now, this idea of sackcloth, it was a thing back then where they wore it. It was an idea of repentance, because they were mourning. So it was not that they were mourning for something like I'm mourning someone's death, but it was this idea of I'm mourning what I've done. You know, like I'm mourning the fact that I have disobeyed or that I've gone so far away from God. It was that type of mourning. They were mourning the fact that they were this God that they were hearing about, this God that became real to them. So they were mourning their lives that they lived prior to making that decision. So this was like sackcloth. You might read that and be like, oh, what does that mean? So it was a big deal then. It was a very big deal. It meant something huge. But what's even awesome is we see going further, when Jonah's warning reached, this is verses 6 through 9. When Jonah's warnings reached the king of Nineveh, he rose from the throne, took off his royal robes, covered himself with sackcloth, and sat down in the dust. This is the proclamation he used in Nineveh. By the decree of the king of his most nobles, do not let people or animals, herds or flocks taste anything. Do not let them eat or drink, but let the people and animals be covered with sackcloth. Let everyone call urgently on God. Let them give up their evil, wicked ways and their violence. Who knows? God may relent with compassion, turn His fierce anger, so that we will not perish. And so I think this is awesome. So the actual king, right, of all people, takes off his royal robe. This is a sign of like exalted position. So this is a big deal. And these, like we're talking about back then in the day, right? When the kings had someone who ate their food before them to just make sure it was poisoned. And this guy, you know, these people have a very big like status. It's totally different than what we would think of it today. It's not just like, oh, I took off my suit jacket. He's taking off this robe that exalts his position, that declares who he is in that city. And he takes it off, puts on a sackcloth. So he's now saying, he's giving God the reins. He's making him the king, essentially. So this is a really big deal. But we see it's all because Jonah obeyed. He did what he really didn't want to do, but he obeyed and did it. And look at all the fruit that came from it. And one of the things it's not particularly mentioned, but one of the things I have to think of is there was a time where God asked him to go, there was a time of disobedience, and there was a time where he went. This whole time in between, how much more people were murdered, women were raped, you know, people, just horrible things, people tortured in that process, in that time. So it's like, yeah, Jonah at the end, it was great, right? But there was still a consequence for that disobedience. There's all this time in between where he could have went, and all these other things still happened, right? It was a wicked city. It's not like it just was on pause while he wasn't there. It was still going on. So it just reminds us of the urgency sometimes of, if God calls us, go now. Don't wait, right? Would you want someone to wait on your life? Right? You would want someone, if someone was supposed to come to your life, would you want them to wait an extra 2 months, 2 years, 5 years, whatever it is? Or would you want them to rescue now? And so when I think of it as it's and I don't say that to discourage. I say that to encourage going forward. So we don't look back with regret. What happened has happened. So the point is, don't look back. Don't look back and say, oh, that's not the point of this. The point is how much more important it is to look forward. To say, when God calls me to be obedient, it is really important that I'm obedient because of the consequences and things that can happen when I'm not. But it's also an encouragement to say, well, Vinny, I don't think God would want me to be his servant. I don't think God would want me to be there. You don't know what I've done. Well, Jonah clearly just blatantly disobeyed, yet he still got used. He made it to the Bible, right? So if Jonah can make it to the Bible with this clear disobedience, right, then God can use anybody. It doesn't matter what you've done. You can always turn around. You can always turn back. It doesn't matter. God loves you. He loves all of us, right? So we see that Nineveh humbled themselves. We see that the king has now changed things. We see the whole place turning around. And so one of the things that I think is funny is that we'll see coming up in a few moments is Jonah's frustration with this. But right before that, we see that when God saw what they did and how they turned from their evil ways, he relented and did not bring the destruction that he had threatened. So now not only do they know God, but now they have the opportunity to receive his mercy and grace. God withheld the punishment that he was originally going to put on them, and because they had relented and they turned. So we see a couple different things here. We see God's love and mercy, because right, God decided not to destroy Nineveh after all of these years of wickedness, after all of these things, right? So that just tells me it's never too late for anybody. We always have an opportunity to turn to God, and God will always be there because he loves us and he has so much mercy and grace for us. But then we also see the patience and sovereignty of God, right? Because God had every right to give up on Jonah and say, I'm getting someone else. I'm done with you. But he said, I'm giving you a second chance. And so we see that he has incredible patience, right? So many times people look at the Old Testament and they focus on all these things like, look at how horrible God is and blah, blah. But it's like you see the heart of God in these passages, yet we somehow look at the big things, right? Because we see, oh, God did this. But it's like a lot of times when you read, it's like he didn't want to do those things, right? It's like, what do you expect when your people for 200 years are just completely ignoring you, right? And yet we want, we would never expect that in real life, right? We don't expect people to do something wrong and never any justice be paid, yet we get mad at God when that happens, right? When we look at the Old Testament sometimes. But it's like we see in verses like this, he doesn't want that to be the case. He wants you to come to him. He wants you to be there with him. He wants you to have a relationship with him. He wants people to obey him. He wants, and it sounds like, oh, he wants me to obey him, but he does it for our good, right? It's like no one yells at a parent for telling their kid not to play in the street, right? the parent does that to protect the child, right? So when God asks us to do things, a lot of times it's for our protection, it's for our own good, it's to help other people. It's not to take away from our experience, it's not to take away from our life, it's actually to give our life more, right? How many times could you avoid, maybe gossip or hurt in your heart or different things by doing things that God doesn't want you to do? But if you just listen, you can avoid a lot of that junk. I know personally for me, that's, when I flip the switch, so to speak, it's like totally different. Just totally different, in terms of all the junk that I used to have to deal with that I don't have to anymore. And so I just love the fact that God is a God of love and mercy and patience and sovereignty, and He wants us, and He always will give us second chances. It's never too late. And so sorry, let me grab some water, sorry. My throat is drying out. We'll be back in a brief moment. I'm used to talking a lot, but so for me, what I think is interesting, like I said, is Jonah's response. So Jonah in chapter 4, verses 1 to 3 says, "But to Jonah this seemed very wrong, and he became angry. He prayed to the Lord, 'Isn't this what I said when I was still at home? That is what I tried to forestall by fleeing to Tarshish. I knew that you are gracious and compassionate, God, a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abounding in love, a God who relents from sending calamity. Now the Lord, take away my life, for it is better for me to die than live.'" We see that Jonah is literally so upset at the fact that God spared these people that he wants to die. Like, I don't understand. He's not focusing on the fact that he was once a person who was far from God, right? We forget that sometimes. We all forget. Like, for me, it's like I've lived a life prior to being up here, prior to being someone who's able to speak at a church. I had a life prior to that. And there was a moment in my life where I actually thought, there's no way I could ever become a pastor because of my life. But it's like, when I read things like this, right, we can always move forward. It's never too late. And so, but it's funny because if we forget what God's done for us, then we don't want that to happen to other people, right? We lose that heart sometimes. We want to see people suffer. We want to see people get what they deserve. Yet, did we really deserve what we got in terms of an eternal life with God? Do we really deserve that when we think about on a regular basis of maybe how much we really don't honor Him, or things that we say or think or do, or whatever the case is, right? But yet, if we can come with that heart posture of remembering where we were, then we will never want to think of other people. We'll never want to resist for that reason. We would always want to help people. I mean, maybe it's, I mention coworkers all the time. It's like you have a coworker that you just hate, right? And maybe they have lunch or they don't have lunch, and you're just like, whatever. But it's like, is that what God would want you to do? Maybe He wants you to take that opportunity to help them. It doesn't matter how horrible they treat you, right? Because we never know how doing things can soften people's hearts, right? You guys have, refresher. It's like that story with me when I worked at Penny's, and there was a kid who didn't really like me, right? And I felt like God wanted me to give him a birthday card. And it was like a simple $5 or $10 gift card, nothing crazy. And the kid didn't like me, thought I was, couldn't figure me out, whatever the case is. Give it to him, gives me a hug, says thank you. People forgot my birthday, ends up being invited to his grad party, comes to my wedding. I mean, we don't know how the smallest act can really just flip a switch with people. We don't know. And I could sit there and say, well, who cares about that kid? He hasn't even given me a chance, right? But we have to sometimes not be afraid, because I was also partly like, he's gonna think I'm nuts, this is gonna be weird. At work, everyone's gonna call me the weird guy, give stuff to the people who hate him. So it's just there was that sense of what the heck is this gonna look like too, but I just trusted and obeyed. And I say that because that's one good time. There's plenty of times where I could talk all day about how I haven't made the right choices, but and one of the things, kind of even going back to the idea of this time in between, this time lapse before he went to Nineveh. For me, I think about my life, right? I'm up here, right? And I've had those moments, right? And I've had to have God kind of pull me back and say, stop thinking about that. But moments of, what if I had made that decision sooner? how many more people could I have impacted in a good way? How much sooner could I have been speaking to impact lives and give the messages God's given my heart, right? I could think that way. And to some extent, it's like I look at younger people who start off and they're on fire and they're 18 and they're whatever, and it took me till I was like 25, whatever. It's like, but we can't make those comparisons, because what it is it doesn't matter, because at one point I came back and I made the choice, and look at where I'm at. This is not me. This is not Vinny, right? This is all God. The way God orchestrates things, through my dad and through Laura and all these weird connections, and just how things constantly work out. God will always give us an opportunity if we decide to make that choice, right? I'm a living, breathing example, right? I felt the call of the pastor in my heart when I was a kid. And I decided to go off and go crazy and just do whatever I wanted to do, and didn't really live a life for God. It's like I gave myself the proclaimed Christian title, but I never actually was a Christian in the sense of living it out, right? We can wear a uniform and call ourselves a soldier, but we're not actually a soldier until we're actually preparing, training, and in battle. It's like, so giving yourself a title doesn't make you something, right? And so for me, it's like that was the thing that I was doing, is I had this calling on my heart, and I just continue to do whatever I wanted to do, go out, and then it took me until I was 24 to really make that decision. But it's like, I'm 31 now, and look where I'm at, and it's awesome, But it also, there's that reality of, I want people who are younger to get it, and to save them from what I had to go through. You know what I mean? To save them from all the crap, all the junk, self-medicating, all these things that I didn't need to do. It's like, I want to save them from that. So it's like, it gives us also an encouragement and a urgency to help those who are younger, to want to help them, to guide them sooner and earlier, and to make sure that, hey, listen, it's because I love you, but we have to do that right strategically. We don't want to ever pound people over the head and get them to turn away. That's just as bad as never telling them at all. So we have to be strategic, and we have to really just share love, right? Because God is a patient God, so we need to be patient with people. And so I just share that story personally, because it's for me, it's an actual real life example, and I'm sure we could all see those examples in our lives. So we see that Jonah, right? He's upset with God's mercy. He's frustrated. And Israel, as a place, they always wished wrath on the people who didn't follow God. They would rather Nineveh, right? He would rather Nineveh die than them live. He'd rather them not be saved. And I just think it's silly, because God's like, who are you to tell me? Who are you? Like, this is my creation. And so in verses 4, 5 to 10, he really puts him in his place. God puts Jonah in his place. So Jonah had gone out and sat down at a place east of the city. There he made himself a shelter, sat in the shade, and waited to see what would happen in the city. Then the Lord provided a leafy plant and made it grow over Jonah, to give him shade for his head, to ease his discomfort. And Jonah was very happy about the plant. But at dawn the next day, God provided a worm, which chewed the plant so that it withered. When the sun rose, God provided a scorching east wind, and the sun blazed on Jonah's head, so he grew faint. He wanted to die and said, "It would be better for me to die than live." But God said to Jonah, "Is it right for you to be angry about the plant?" Jonah says, "It is. And I'm angry. I'm so angry I wish I were dead." But the Lord said, "You have been concerned about this plant, though you did not tend to it or make it grow. It sprang up overnight and died overnight." So it's like Jonah's upset about something that he's not even taking care of, right? God provides him a plant for a day. He should be thankful for the moment that he has the plant, rather than focusing on the time that he doesn't. Right? He shifts his focus. So rather than being thankful, because the plant wasn't there to begin with. So the fact that he even had the providence, the provision for that moment, he should be thankful. But yet instead, he turns around and God's like,